45 years ago as part of a hippie back to the land movement. And back in the 60s, there was a revolution. It really didn't happen. People started doing cocaine instead. But some people actually moved to the country and started homesteading and cooking on wood stoves and just learning how to live like outside of the system. And so that's what we did. And it was really fun. Eventually I figured that I did need some money, and so I learned how to grow vegetables and sell vegetables. So that's what I do, run a pretty good sized farm, about 40 head of cattle. We have about 6 acres of vegetables, fruit trees, milk goats and chickens. Just mostly we're doing stuff to take care of ourselves and grow some extra to earn the money. And really that's basically about it. I've been growing vegetables all my life, and man, have I made mistakes. And that's what is the advantage here. So I hope to keep you all from making mistakes.
What's your growing methods?
My growing methods?
Yeah, talk about that.
Growing. But you want to hear the word organic, I bet.
Or biodynamic, whichever.
Yeah, so my dad was an organic gardener, and so that's the method that I chose. And he also had a book about biodynamics that he liked, and so I got into that too. But mind you, he was born before chemicals, and he was an organic farmer as a kid. That's just what they did back in the 1800s, 1900s, So really nothing new, and I found, even though there's like all these new books out there, really some of the best books are the ones that were written before the chemicals. And this was in the early 1900s. So back in the late 1800s, man, did people know how to farm. They did. Every farm had animals and compost piles, and crop rotations, and cover crops, and use of lime and minerals, and they knew all that stuff, how to till the soil. And a lot of it was such common knowledge, that everybody knew these things. And a 7th grader knew how to graft a fruit tree and do all this kind of stuff that we all might think is hard, but it's actually, if you're not on the computer all the time, it's pretty easy to learn all this stuff. So does anybody have any questions about their gardens? Oh, now don't be shy. Come on now.
I've got contender green beans.
Which
Contender.
Contender?
Yeah. And they're the seed I saved from last year.
Okay.
And the first leaves when they came out had brown spots.
I've seen that before. I think that's from planting a little early. So beans don't like any kind of cold weather. And I've seen that. They come up and those seed leaves will have little brown spots. But if it warms up, everything goes fine.
Yeah. The emphasis on the first leaves, the rest of them has been out.
Yeah. Sometimes, you go all winter long and you get your seed catalogs out, and spring comes along, and the first warm day you go out there and you think summer's here. That ain't the way it is in Tennessee. You will get fooled every time. The older I get, the later I plant. Yeah. Not quite as anxious as I was.
The manure that's in the cow poop, like the Simon method, when do we throw that and put that on the garden?
As soon as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, so any of the biodynamic preparations work very well, but they only work if you use them. If I give them to you, you put them in a bag and you put it somewhere, they don't work near as good.
What would be your top 3 or 5 foolproof perennials?
Perennials. Oh, that's a good question. As far as fruit goes, I'm a big fan of blueberries, raspberries, and Concord grape. So we grow the heritage raspberry. So raspberries are something that, and blueberries really weren't grown around Tennessee when I first moved here, but I grew up in Illinois, and people have them up there a lot, so I tried them down here, and I think a few of us bought 400 blueberry plants in the early 70s and set them out, and we had really good luck with them. And since then, I mean, a lot of people grow them. The trick to growing the blueberry, though, is you have to put the sulfur on the soil. And blueberries are very shallow rooted. If you dig one up, the roots are only like that deep. And that layer of soil has to stay moist. And so we put lots of, by peat moss or really rotted wood chips or leaf mold and things of this nature as a mulch around the berries. And then I like the southern rabbit eye varieties rather than there's a northern hybrid too. I like those too, but what's really nice about the southern rabbit eyes is that they sprout up suckers, and you can dig those suckers up and start a new patch.
Sure.
And so all of these things, the word perennial confused me for a long time, because it kind of means it'll be there forever. Well, do you know anything that lasts forever? Except maybe taxes. Yeah. So what I found is that forever on like a raspberry bush is about 8 years. And then they get weeds sprouting up in them, or they might get a virus or something like that. So it's nice to every so often to renew your bed. So I'll take some of the berries or grapes or whatever and just make a new bed out of them. The raspberry variety we like is called Heritage, and it's different from the raspberries of my youth in that it's what they call a primocane, and we mow them down in the fall, and they sprout up, and they don't make any berries in June and July, but they make berries in August and September. The old-fashioned raspberries, we could make a cane one year, then the next year that cane would bear raspberries in late June and early July. So this required pruning out the old ones by hand and a little bit more work. But the reason that I switched over, I had my dad's varieties, but I don't have them anymore because an interesting phenomenon happened about 40 years ago. My neighbors in Saline and Livingston said, the Japanese beetle is going to devour everything you got. And I'd never seen one. Well, sure enough, about 2 years later, they were moving at the rate of about 20 to 30 miles from the east coast coming this way. And boy, when they first hit here, does anybody remember the Japanese beetles coming in? I mean, every rose bush, plum tree, raspberry bush, all that stuff was covered in these little shiny beetles, and they would sell these traps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was a good way to draw more to them. And then my friend Adam, he came up with this great idea, and he bought one of these traps, but instead of putting a bag underneath it, he put a pipe, and he hung it over his pond about that high off the water level and fed fish with them.
Chickens love them, mine.
And chickens love them too. That's right. But what was nice about this heritage raspberry is that the beetles came and they were gone by the end of July when the raspberries started bearing. So the beetles weren't a problem. So and then the grapes I like are Concord, and that's what we call an American grape. So a lot of the grape varieties out there, for like wine and this kind of stuff, are European grapes, and they suffer here in America, the diseases and stuff. But the Concord grape is a very thick-skinned grape. The grapes are a little bit of a looser cluster, and they resist some of the diseases. Now we will still have brown rot in the grapes if it's a wet August, which you can't ever tell around here with weather. But and a grape vine, again, is easy to propagate. You just cut a twig of it when you're pruning them and leave about 3 or 4 buds on it and bury it in sand. And then when spring comes, I just line them out in the garden and make new grape plants that'll root. and the raspberries and blueberries, just dig out plants from the bed that we have. The big problem with the perennials is Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, potato vine stuff, any kind of perennial weed gets in there. Well, with a potato patch, you dig the potatoes out, you can plow all that stuff out. But with a perennial, you can't ever get back in there. And once they get under those roots, it's really hard to get them out. So before I plant a perennial bed, I try to just work the ground up for a year or two with some annuals, compost it really good, and make sure I've got all the grasses and that kind of stuff out of the field before I put it in. Yeah.
Back to the raspberries, I bought some yellow.
Oh, yeah.
Will they cross with the red hair?
No, so
No.
these, to get a cross, you actually would have to take the seed of the raspberry, plant it, and get a new raspberry plant.
Yeah.
But when we propagate from a sucker, that's called asexual propagation, and it's like cloning. And so you can have the yellow ones and the red ones and
Side by
purple, all side by side. They will.
Okay, that's it, okay. Good.
What about deer predation on the blueberries?
Well, if you don't have deer protection, you'll have deer problems.
Yeah.
So deer would probably be one of the main hindrances to horticulture around here in many places. So when I first moved to Tennessee, there weren't any deer. Yeah, so deer were eradicated by humans for hundreds of years because back then humans lived here. The humans don't live here now. You live where your food comes from. And most people's food comes from a grocery store, it comes from far away. So it doesn't matter if there's deer roaming around. But for back when people had to get their food locally, they couldn't have deer roaming around, so they eradicated them. And
Deer, the turkey,
yeah.
the large woodpeckers,
Groundhogs,
The
things
what?
like that. Groundhogs, all those kinds
Yeah.
of things. They're
I
really
like woodpecker, they were extinct.
They're rough on a garden. So we have big deer fences that we put up around the gardens, and then in our pastures we just really can't grow cover crops like we would like to improve the soil because the deer love the legumes that grow clovers and things. So yeah, you have to protect them. So there are other ways to try to protect them. They'll work temporarily, and these would be things like scents. So you can get like Irish Spring soap or various things of that nature and put up, and they'll smell weird, and it might keep deer away for a while. But if you, the fence is the only thing that you can sleep at night. Sure.
You tell them how high, 8 foot.
Yeah, we have an 8-foot fence, and then there's a 3-dimensional fence that you can build too, where you have a small fence and then another fence next to it. And I learned this a long time ago. If I had a little fence and then just trellised the first row.
Do you have any advice on asparagus?
Asparagus.
Ooh.
Yeah, so asparagus is a heavy feeder, and it's a perennial that then is, in my experience, always gets devoured by grasses and things like that. So when I lived up in the Midwest, we grew a lot of asparagus, and it grew wild. Mind you, the soils up there were as black as your shirt and about that deep, and they were just lovely Illinois soils, and asparagus had been brought there from Europe and escaped, and you could just go out to the ditches and pick wild.
So on this.
Stalking the Wild Asparagus was a book. And so if you're going to grow asparagus, I recommend the raised bed method, where you can really have a border of some kind. You have to keep those grasses out. But it's a great food. Comes on before hardly anything else to eat. And we usually would pick it for 4 to 6 weeks and then just let it go. When it's when the stalks start getting smaller than your fingers, you know, it's getting skinny, you just let it go. And it makes a beautiful ferny bush. It's a great landscape plant, and it's a lovely thing, but it does, because it's got such thin leaves, it doesn't shade the ground out as good as, you know, something with big fat leaves.
Do you think mulching of any kind would help with that, or?
Well, mulching works excellent, except for the fact that Bermuda grass loves mulch.
Gotcha.
And around here, that's a big problem.
Okay.
So again, if you want to plant asparagus, the best thing to do is not plant asparagus, but grow other things. Make sure you've gotten rid of the Bermuda grass within some kind of border, and then plant it.
Okay.
So in a lot of perennial culture, the recommendation is to work the ground for a year before you plant it. And that way you can, you know, subsoil it and lime it and build the humus up and all this kind of stuff, so that when you plant it, because you're never going to be able to, you know, plow it again. So you do all that stuff for a year ahead of time. And then put it down.
We just did a no-till garden swamp line. What would you use for the mulch, kind of to keep the grass out of the rows?
Yeah, so in a raised bed situation, mulching is a really good idea. Whenever we raise the ground, it dries out, and we're subject to the droughts around here. And so old hay is what I use mostly because I'm a hay farmer. And as a farmer, my crops are not always that great, you know. So especially something like hay. You know, you make hay, we're cutting hay right now, but it could rain. And then that will be the hay that we'll use for mulching. Okay. So I always have 100 rolls of hay, I always have some that I might use to mulch. So the trick to gardening is to always keep the soil full of rotting vegetable matter. And we do this with mulches, compost, cover crops, and things of that nature. So anytime we can, we're always on the lookout for organic material. And another thing that you can do in a raised bed is mulch the outside of the bed. And that keeps the sun from hitting the blocks or whatever your bed's made of. And keep that mulch, and also keep the grass a little bit farther away too.
So what do you find organic hay? I've been hearing more and more about all the chemicals. What do you find the organic hay? Because I've been hearing more and more of the chemicals are sprayed.
Yeah, okay, so there is an issue now of some farmers will spray a certain chemical, I think it's called Graze on. And when that is sprayed on the hay, then that hay can poison your garden. So the older herbicides like Roundup weren't systemic. And so if a field is sprayed with Roundup, you can still use that hay. But these newer ones get inside the plant somehow and are persistent. They stay there. And actually, I've heard people using the manure from the horses that eat that hay can be poisonous too. So how do you do it? You always go to the poorest farmer you can find.
What's your best deterrent for squash bugs?
Yeah, squash bugs are the ones that smell real bad when you squish them, and they lay these golden eggs on the undersides of the squash. And so in a field situation, they're not much of a problem. So I grow an acre of winter squash, and we don't have, you know, there'll be some bugs and stuff, that's not a problem. But if you only have 3 squash plants, you can't afford to lose one. So the trick for the squash bug is to lay a board down. And the squash bug likes to spend the night undercover so it doesn't get dew on it. And so if there's any kind of a layer or something like a board, go there in the morning, flip that over, and your squash bugs will be right there. You can kill them.
Squash them.
And then while you're weeding your garden, you would look for those eggs too.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are some other squash problems. There's one called a borer. So do you ever have a squash plant that looks beautiful and then the next day it's wilted? and you touch it and it just comes loose right at the root. That's the squash borer. And it's a moth. It's an orange and black moth that flies, a real pretty moth that flies around and then lays its egg. But it has to lay the egg between the dirt where your hill squash is and the first leaves. And so in that stem right there is where they come and lay the egg. So if you protect that, you can keep these squash borers away, and you can protect it with a nylon stocking, a piece of burlap, or just a bunch of hay or something, but just so that the moth itself doesn't have access to that stem.
That first little section.
Yeah.
We have a friend on our street who gardens organically, and she's got a crow, now two, right?
Yeah.
Dead crows hanging. We're like,
Crow or a buzzard?
well,
Yeah,
does
they're
it
crows.
keep the other crows away? Like she said
Oh,
that
okay,
they were
that's
coming
okay.
in, and I
Wow.
guess it's like a warning, like this will have to be.
That's not
It's a
uncommon.
And then
crow.
sleeps in that.
Seriously,
I've seen people hanging deers and groundhog hides up in that.
But I mean, do you think, or
I think there's some truth to
experience
that.
that's something to do?
So the place we have trouble with the crows would be like the sweet corn patch.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, I had some pretty innovative mentors teaching me when I started learning. And I remember them saying one time, well, yeah, just put a little corn out next to the field and tell the crows, here, you can have this corn. It's easier to get than digging in my field. And so I still do that. I'll put a little pile of corn around the corn patch.
Crows, they know who brings them presents too.
Yeah.
Like they're smart.
They're very smart animals. They can be tamed. You know, and you can have a pet crow.
A little bit about maybe pH of your soil and why that's important.
Yeah, the questions about soil pH, and this is a measurement of the potential of hydrogen in a cation exchange. So the cation exchange is the positively charged elements. So all of the elements that make up a plant have a electrical charge, depending on how many electrons are extra or missing in their outer shell. That's probably chemistry for today. But the ones that are acidic, or that would lower your pH, would be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. And these are all ones that are relatively free. We don't even worry about them too much. They come with the air and this, that. But the positively charged ones are the minerals in the soil. And these would be calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, iron, and those things. And they're positively charged. So when we add either of these things to our soil, we should add the other ones. That makes sense? We want to keep a balance. So when we put on compost, that's carbon. We put on plowing down a cover crop, this would have a lot of hydrogen, nitrogen, things of this nature. Those are all tending to lower our pH. So then we put on things like lime or Epsom salts, maybe, or potassium type of things, like green things, or granite, wood ashes. These all raise the pH. So, but we don't want to do one without the other. So if you just keep, and this is a problem that I learned the hard way. So my dad was an organic farmer in Illinois, where the soil had so many minerals in it, you didn't need it. It's where the glaciers ended. So 15,000 years ago, these glaciers came down, and they went right past Chicago, and then they receded. And that whole valley in there, from Springfield up to middle of Wisconsin or so, are some of the blackest soils in the world because it's where the glacier was, and all the dead mammoths and trees and stuff rotted, and it was like a giant compost pile for about 600 miles around. And it was a beautiful black soils that were world famous. So I moved to Tennessee, and I started using these organic methods. I never put lime on, and my soils were not, things weren't really clicking. And then I learned about lime. I put some lime on, and that year the garden, I just became an immediate believer in the value of lime. And so it's really important. And wood ashes are really valuable too, because a tree has access to these minerals that have leached down into lower soil layers. And these are like the cations are water soluble, and they leach down, so you can have plenty of minerals like 2 feet down, but your annual crops can't get to them. But the trees get to them, and then when we burn something, we burn up all the carbon and all of the stuff that's burnable. What's left over are the hard minerals: calcium, potassium, magnesium, iron, manganese, and wood. And all these things don't get burned. Yeah, they're left over in the ash. So that's the way human beings used to farm before they settled down and started raising animals. And we call it slash and burn. And they would go someplace, they would burn it. That released enough fertility to grow crops for a few years, but then they had to move on. It wasn't until they domesticated animals that they were able to stay in one place and nothing mattered. So one of the best ways to test for pH is called litmus paper. You all heard of litmus paper? It's just a little strip, and it'll, you have to use distilled water, you wet it with soil, and then if it turns blue, that means it's alkaline. If it turns pink, that means it's acid. And there's a little color chart that goes with it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you might have it for a swimming pool.
Yeah.
Right, that's the thing about color.
Okay, I see that.
Yeah. They also, you can buy a pH meter. You know, you stick in the soil and a little needle will tell you the pH. Or you can send a soil sample off. I think the UT still does pretty cheap soil tests.
They went up.
Yeah, $6 or something. Or I can't remember what it is.
I think it's going to like 15.
UT
yeah,
can
I
give
haven't
you,
done one in a few years.
Yeah.
but I believe UT can give you a full breakdown of all your nutritional
They do.
parts as well. It won't just give you a pH; it gives you a full printout. And if you put in for organic recommendations, they can
Yeah,
provide
you
those
specify
recommendations.
what you're gonna
Yes, sir.
raise. Yeah.
The problem with that is that they don't break down the cation to the different ones. So there's calcium and then there's magnesium. Both of these raise the soil pH, but they also need to be in balance too. And just like if you go to a doctor and they might tell you need to take a calcium supplement, well, oftentimes they'll say, but if you do that, then you're going to have to take a magnesium supplement too, because you'll throw your body out of balance. And so, same thing with the soil. You want to keep these things in a certain balance. It's about 1 to 7. So if there's 70% calcium, you want to have about 10%. If you have high magnesium in your soil, they'll be sticky. And when it's wet, you get on your shoes. It'll be kind of sticky, like slimy. Whereas if it's, and then when it gets hot and dry, they get real hard. So that's an indication of a high magnesium soil. And that's exacerbated by the lime that comes from Gordonsville, which is a byproduct from a zinc operation. So they sell the lime really cheaply. It's like $4 a ton. It's kind of in their way to get to the zinc. And this is a good lime if you have low magnesium soil. But if you have a high magnesium soil, it exacerbates that condition. And you'd rather get your lime from Franklin lime from Crab Orchard. It's a little bit farther away, so the lime is going to cost a little more, like $14 a ton. But it's 98% calcium and hardly any magnesium in it. And so it'll balance that out.
What's it called? Second place?
It's called Franklin lime.
Magnesium excess in your soil would be difficult to solve too.
It's what?
Excess magnesium in your soil would be difficult problem to solve.
Right. So it's one way is gypsum,
Just
and that's calcium sulfate. And so that's, you're adding, say your soils have the right pH, but you got too much magnesium, Well, you don't really want to add calcium because you're going to raise the pH too high. You add calcium sulfate. The sulfur then is acidic. And so gypsum doesn't raise the soil pH, but it adds calcium.
Why you don't have bug problems? Because the way you feed the soil and it puts the sugars in the plants, that kind of.
Yeah, so very good.
Different soil health.
No,
Yeah.
Chris has been trying to understand me for many years.
One of these days.
One of our problems in gardening is having nitrogen in a nitrate form. So nitrogen is 78% of the atmosphere. And so it's very common, but it has an outer shell of 3 extra electrons, but it also, you could say it has lacking 3 electrons. So when nitrogen is in the air, it's never just nitrogen, it's always N2. And it's triple bonded to itself and extremely hard to break apart. So, and nitrogen is the limiting factor in not only plant growth, but almost all chemical reactions. So nitrogen is extremely important. It's what grows plants. So people had to use manures. That's where they got their nitrogen from. Manures, and also the legume family of plants, and this would be clovers and peas and beans. So there were no farms that didn't have animals in legume crops, because that's where they got their nitrogen. So there was no other way to get it. There's one other way that nitrogen can come, and that is through lightning. Lightning will actually break it apart. So that's how hard it is to break this stuff apart. So they didn't have many bug problems because they composted those manures and those legumes, and consequently the nitrogen that was in the soil was in the animal, the bug poop or the animal poop or the legume bacteria nodules, and this is amino acid nitrogen that the plants can use directly. When they started to use chemical fertilizers, that's in a nitrate form. You've heard of ammonium nitrate, urea, all of these things, and even fresh manure. If you can smell it, what you're smelling is ammonia. This is NH4. These things are hard for the plant to use. So the plant can use them, but the plant has to use its own sugars to break, as energy, to break down the nitrogen into the amino acid nitrogen that you use. So whenever a plant uses up its sugar, it becomes susceptible to bugs. So there's a meter that we use to measure the sugar content of a plant. This is called a refractometer, and it measures the Brix level. And whenever the Brix level is high, your plants have a lot of sugar in them, the bugs can't eat them because the bugs don't have a pancreas. So the reason that we like ice cream and sweet things is because we have a pancreas. We can digest sugar. Well, these bugs, they can't digest sugar. So if you want to grow plants without bugs, we have to free our soils of nitrates and make sure the nitrogen is composted in the amino acid form. And so we do this by always composting stuff and growing lots of legumes. And we avoid putting things on the soil that have nitrate. And that would be fish emulsions or chicken litter or just any kind of thing that has nitrate.
What do you think about rabbit manure?
Yeah, so
Because it's like half composted.
rabbit manure is very pre-composted. It's sort of like goat manure. It comes in real handy little pellets. rather than what I deal with is these big kind of pudding things from the cows.
But I just wasn't sure, like, we've used it in the past, I mean, we're in Florida, sandy soils, you can play with
You
it.
really need it in sandy soil.
But here, we started the rabbit tree again for many reasons, but they pee, you know, like, they pee on the poop, and I didn't know if the ammonia and
Yeah,
that,
so,
or if anything.
again, it would just be a matter of taking putting some litter, some carbonaceous litter underneath your
Oh,
rabbit.
yeah, we do that for sure.
Yeah, and then when you clean it, put that in a pile outside and rot it
Okay,
about 6 months until it doesn't smell bad, and then put it on the
yeah.
So that's the proper way.